Do you trust the police department after what your family has been through?
No, sir. No, never.
Can anything change that?
I don't think so. Not now.
Cops should be on the side of the law, protecting the citizens and doing what is right for justice. However, these 9 dirty cops are the ones we need protection from.
A judge sentenced Sergeant Wayne Jenkins to 25 years in federal prison.
You have a gun in probably, I would say 2 1/4 just by looking at it.
Imagine a case being so wild that HBO had to make a 6-part series about it. A chilling discovery was made inside the Baltimore Police Department. 8 police officers were deep into running an organized crime ring. The level of deep corruption was led by our perpetrator, Wayne Jenkins. Wayne Jenkins was the head of the Gun Trace Task Force, responsible for a few unexpected crimes of a police officer. He was responsible for planting evidence, running robberies, and stealing drugs from looted pharmaceutical companies.
Newly released videos show the officers pretending to open a safe for the first time.
Hey, Sarge! Hey, come downstairs right quick. They about to get it open.
But in fact, prosecutors say they'd already gotten in, took $100 grand for themselves, then pretended this was the first time they'd laid eyes on the cash.
The intention behind creating this task force wasn't what it was being used for at all. Jenkins and his crew robbed people at gunpoint, stole and sold drugs, making more than $1 million in the process. That was not all, because to the list of his crimes, he caused the loss of lives. In a recovered body camera footage, Jenkins and his team were seen attempting to rob 2 men in a car, which caused the men to run. Jenkins chased the car until he hit the car, causing the death of Albert Davis. The action of Jenkins and his team dealt a huge blow to the victims' families. The daughter of Davis was asked 7 years after this incident if she could ever trust the police again after what happened to her father. Here is what his daughter had to say about it.
7 years later, we find out that corrupt cops who swore to protect and serve were nothing more than criminals. He apologized for it, Mr. Jenkins, but it still hurts.
This isn't the worst of it, so we have to ask questions. How did years of organized crime go unnoticed in the police force? And how were they finally exposed? Quite shockingly, one man led to the unraveling of this life of crime. A man was convicted after he sold the heroin that killed a teenager. After evidence was admitted, it was discovered from the wiretaps that the voices of the 8 men, including Jenkins and his team, were heard constantly during conversations. Upon further investigations, it was discovered that this task force had been involved in a drug deal, and there was nothing about them that was law-like. In this case, it had been one of the task force members, Mamadou Gondo, who had been protecting the drug crew so they could build their illegal business into a $1 million enterprise. Besides these recordings, there were also discoveries of irregular official records that looked like they were tampered with. With the overwhelming amount of evidence stacked against this corrupt task force, the FBI had enough to arrest and indict them. Wayne Jenkins was finally tried and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison on June 7, 2018. It was said that he cried during his sentencing and asked the judge for mercy. He had earlier told an attorney that he could not go to prison for life because of his children. His lawyer also said he showed signs of remorse, and he reportedly told the judge he was ashamed of what he had done. But it's hard not to show remorse when you're caught, so we're inclined not to believe Jenkins. But in the case of Marcus Everard, it's even harder to believe.
Sergeant Everard guilty on all counts and Corporal Weems guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reckless conduct, and oaths of office. Now, the 2 were accused of tasing 24-year-old Gregory Towns to death back in April of 2014.
This is Marcus Everard, a former police officer from East Point, Michigan, who launched the world into a debate in 2014 when he and another officer, Howard Weems, tasered 24-year-old Gregory Towns to death. On April 11, 2014, the 2 ex-officers responded to a report about domestic violence from Towns' girlfriend, Aisha Smith. She had called the police with claims that Towns had abused her, so Everard and Weems went to the house. According to testimony, Towns had tried to run away from the police after he saw them, and as a result, he was caught and handcuffed. He was then instructed by Everard to walk to the car. Towns claimed that he was too tired to walk to the car. Subsequently, Everard and Weems used their tasers on Towns repeatedly until he became unresponsive. The intention was to get Towns to cooperate with them, but it resulted in him getting murdered. The prosecution called the act a violation because at the time the two officers tasered Towns. He was already handcuffed and he was having a hard time breathing. At first, it was said that it wasn't the taser that killed him, but the fact that Gregory Towns had an underlying health condition, a rare sickle cell trait, which just happened to be an unfortunate coincidence. Everard was eventually charged with involuntary manslaughter and felony murder because of this incident. From past records, it was shown that Everard was an aggressive officer. During the investigation, it was revealed that Everard had used the taser on Towns for more than 40 seconds, which is longer than departmental policy allows. The defense claimed that Everard didn't know about Towns' health conditions and only used his taser per his training because Towns was resisting arrest. Marcus was eventually charged for this death, and it became the first time in the history of Michigan that a police officer had been convicted of a crime for using a taser on an individual. Everard was eventually sentenced in December 2016. During the verdict, where he was told that he could be facing up to 15 years in jail, Everard seemed really interested in leaving the courthouse and did not show any form of emotion or reaction during the verdict. His lawyer said he was disappointed in what Everard had done, but other than that, nothing else. Eventually, Everard was sentenced to life in prison for what he did. He didn't say anything that was recorded, but it was said that he released a statement where he expressed remorse for his actions. He also said that he knew and understood the impact of what he did on Gregory's girlfriend and child. He said, "I'm truly sorry for the pain that I have caused the Marshall family. I am aware of the fact that nothing I can say or do can bring back their loved one." This case drew the spotlight on the use of force and aggression by police officers and the lack of accountability when cops violate departmental policy. Towns' family was relieved that Everard was held accountable for what he did. Aisha Smith said that she would learn to live with herself and not blame herself for calling Everard and Weems to the house, which consequently led to the death of Gregory Towns. Marcus Everard did not intend to murder Gregory, but in the next case, an off-duty Pentagon officer attempted heroism by killing two people.
Tonight, a former Pentagon police officer is facing more than 2 decades behind bars for a deadly double shooting in Montgomery County.
This is David Dixon, a former Pentagon police officer. In April 2021, he shot and killed 2 men in the parking lot of his building. He was in the parking lot of his Maryland apartment complex when he reportedly saw these men breaking into a car. He was off duty when he shot at 3 men who he claimed were trying to steal a car. He shot 32-year-old Dominic Williams and 38-year-old James Lionel Johnson while they were trying to escape with a car they had broken into. A third man named Michael Thomas survived the shooting and became a witness in the case. Dixon claimed that he shot in self-defense because the burglars were driving towards him. However, video evidence showed that Dixon shot them after the car passed him, and there was no threat to his life. The man who survived said that Dixon had shot without any form of justification, especially as he was off-duty. He would have gotten off with a lighter sentence if he hadn't shot them as a form of stopping them from stealing the car. His attorney said that he did a heroic act because he stopped the burglars from stealing the car. The only survivor admitted to stealing the car on a 911 call after he drove away from the scene of the shooting. This wasn't Dixon's only example of a trigger-happy mentality. In 2020, he pointed a rifle at a homeless woman who was wearing flip-flops in the lobby of his building. He wasn't charged for this offense. Dixon was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his actions, and before he was let away, he apologized for his actions. He told the court that he instinctively reacted, according to his training, but that he was remorseful for what he did. If what David Dixon did shocks you, wait until you hear about the brutal crimes that Wayne Couzens committed because he had a police belt and badge to aid him.
A wholly blameless victim of grotesquely executed crimes. Sarah Everard's final hours said the judge as bleak and agonizing as it's possible to imagine.
In the case of Wayne Couzens, you would not expect what he did under the umbrella of being a cop. It will chill you to your bones. Wayne was a metropolitan officer who was arrested and suspected of kidnapping and murder. In South London, England, 33-year-old Sarah Everard was kidnapped on the 3rd of March, 2021. She had been walking home from a friend's house without knowing she was being followed by a white car. This car had been rented by Couzens from a dealership earlier that morning in Kent. Dashcam footage showed Couzens parking near Sarah and the two standing beside the car. As it turns out, Cousins showed Sarah his police warrant card before handcuffing her and pretending to arrest her for breaching COVID-19 guidelines. The next time the car was spotted, it was captured by CCTV around Kent. Later that night, it is believed that Cousins transferred Sarah to a different car in Shepherdswell and her there. After doing this, he strangled her with his police duty belt. The next time he was seen, Cousins had once again switched to his rental car and drove to a gas station where he was seen buying gas, big builder bags, and duct tape. It seemed like he decided to get rid of Sarah. Cousins then burnt Sarah's body in a refrigerator and dumped her remains in a pond near Cousins' part of his family's property in Hodes Wood, Ashford. On the 8th of March, Cousins turned in his handcuffs and police belt after saying he was suffering from stress. He was arrested on the 9th of March because he was the last person who saw Sarah. She had called her boyfriend before Cousins kidnapped and murdered her. Her boyfriend contacted the police and the search identified Cousins as the primary suspect in her murder.
Do you know Sarah? I don't know. Okay.
For a while, Cousins repeatedly denied ever having interactions with Sarah, even though they showed him a picture of the victim. The officers in charge of the investigation were convinced that Wayne was their culprit, so they pressed further. What Cousins said after their persistence would shock you.
I am in financial and I've been lent on by I don't know who they are. They're a group, a gang, whatever. And they told me, right, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them.
Cousins claimed that he had paid for sex in Folkestone, and as payment, a gang of Eastern Europeans had threatened to harm his family unless he gave them another girl because he had underpaid a sex worker a few weeks before kidnapping Sarah. He claimed that this was the reason he had kidnapped Sarah, so he could hand her over to the gang. He didn't give any defined answers to any of the questions he was asked about how the gang contacted him.
They threatened to take my family away from me. So, at that point, I'm doing what I can to protect my family.
Eventually, Cousins confessed to kidnapping and murdering Sarah Everard on June 8, 2021. He was sentenced in September to life in prison with the tariff of a whole life order, meaning there was no way he would ever be released from jail. Cousins also received an extra 19 months for a previous offense of indecent exposure. The judge who sentenced Cousins said that the murder of Sarah would have been prevented if the previous sexual offenses of Cousins had been taken seriously. Cousins was said to be shaking as his sentence was read, but video evidence was never provided. As a result of this brutal murder, the Met announced that they would stop deploying lone police officers in plain clothing. Wayne Cousins' case was shocking, but nothing will make you lose faith in the law enforcement agencies faster than the horrific actions of a group of cops called the Goon Squad.
In the last hour, 6 former Mississippi officers were sentenced to 15 to 45 years in prison on state charges in the assault and torture of 2 black men. The officers pleaded guilty to charges including hindering prosecution, burglary, home invasion, and aggravated assault.
These 6 men you just saw called themselves the Goon Squad, and it is shocking that such a name is used for a group of law enforcement officers. These 6 committed a series of crimes that would make your blood boil.
5 former deputies and 1 police officer entered this home, no warrant, no evidence that anything was happening there. And they proceeded to torture these men for hours using food, at one point a sex toy, and threatening an execution.
On January 24th, 2023 in Mississippi, these 6 men brutally tortured 2 men named Michael Jenkins and Eddie Parker in some of the most heinous ways possible. Brett McAlpin, Hunter Elward, Christian Dedman, Jeffrey Middleton, Daniel Opdyke, and Joshua Hartfield tortured the men for over an hour and a half. The officers, who referred to themselves as the Goon Squad, went to the area after receiving a report that Jenkins and Parker had entered a home with a white woman. The home belonged to Christy Wally, a childhood friend of Parker who had been paralyzed, and Parker was her caretaker. The Goon Squad broke down the front door and immediately restrained Parker and Jenkins without a search warrant. Wally was in the hospital when this horrific incident happened. The Goon Squad referred to Jenkins and Parker with slurs and insults while beating and torturing the men. Opdyke found a sex toy in the house and forced it into Parker's mouth. Another of the officers, Christian Dedman, threatened to rape the men, and he attempted until he realized that Jenkins had defecated on himself. If you thought that was all, you're wrong. Everard held the two men down and watched as Dedman poured cooking oil, eggs, chocolate syrup, and milk, among other kitchen ingredients, on them. Hartfield also used a taser on the two men while they were tied up. Jenkins and Parker were beaten with a plank and a sword during the torture. After these horrible officers had their fill of torturing the two men, they ordered them to take a shower to hide the evidence of the torture they went through for almost 2 hours. Unfortunately for the victims, it wasn't over. Everard forced his gun into Jenkins' mouth and shot him even though he failed the first time. The bullet tore through the victim's mouth, broke his jaw, and came out of his neck. Before the Goon Squad left, they planted a gun and drugs in the home and accused Jenkins of trying to shoot at them first. They took security footage from the house and threw it into a river. The Goon Squad pleaded guilty to all counts of felonies, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice, among other counts. During the investigation, the lead attorney, Malik Shabazz, said that it was one of the worst things he had ever come across. The time for sentencing came, and it was a long and overdue process. Although the Goon Squad pleaded guilty in August 2022, they weren't sentenced until March 2024. The Goon Squad displayed a variety of reactions as their sentences were read. The man who was regarded as the mafia don of the group, Brett McAlpin, was sentenced to more than 27 years in prison, and his voice was said to be shaking as he addressed the court. The victims described him as a tyrant or a king because he walked around and instructed the other deputies on what to do while they were being tortured. The members of the Goon Squad also said that the squad would not even exist if it wasn't for McAlpin. He apologized for his actions, but it didn't count with the victims, because he had been the reason that the other members came to the Braxton home that day. Daniel Opdyke was sentenced to 17 years in prison, and while he addressed the court, he cried profusely and was very emotional as he delivered his speech. He apologized for sexually assaulting Jenkins, but the victim walked out of the courtroom with his aunt. He pleaded that the reason he was this way was because he had been sexually assaulted by his father until he was 8 years old. He was also responsible for handing over the evidence of the Goon Squad group chat on WhatsApp to the police. After apologizing, he was led away in chains as he wept out of the courtroom. Everard, who had shot Jenkins in the mouth, was sentenced to 20 years, and he also gave an emotional apology to the victims for shooting Jenkins and leaving him to bleed to death. Jeffrey Middleton was sentenced to 17.5 years for obstruction of justice and abuse of the victims. Joshua Hartfield was sentenced to 10 years because he participated in the torture. He was the only officer who wasn't a member of the Rankin County Sheriff's Department. The argument that was given was that the reason he participated was because he applied to work in Rankin. He used a taser on the victims and tried to destroy evidence. He choked and wept as he apologized for failing to help the people who needed him the most. The man who got the longest sentence was Christian Dedman. He was described as oppressive, sick, and the most sexually perverted of all the perpetrators for his actions. He threatened to rape the victims and poured multiple kitchen ingredients on them. Dedman was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He never addressed the victims directly, but he said that he would never forgive himself for the crimes he committed.
For, what, is given and what is done, I forgive that part, but other than that, he still did, what he did, and he has to be punished for that.
If I had to see them again, I would probably just start praying. I'd probably be scared out of my body.
Now that your blood is boiling, let's meet our next dirty cop.
Official misconduct, fabricating evidence, false imprisonment, possession of controlled substances, and drug paraphernalia, and perjury. Wester joined the Jackson County Sheriff's Office in 2016, but it wasn't until 2018 that people started to question his actions.
Zachary Wester's father was a police officer, and everyone had high hopes for him when he was hired as a deputy at the Liberty County Sheriff's Office in 2015. However, within less than a year, Zachary left Liberty County due to claims of sexual misconduct. Despite these allegations, the following year, 2016, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, northwest of Tallahassee, hired him. As an officer for Jackson County, Zachary Wester quickly established a reputation for being an assertive deputy. His aggressive approach led him to making a significant number of drug arrests, earning him recognition within the department and among his peers. However, as summer 2018 approached, the district attorney's investigators began to notice inconsistencies in Zachary's police reports and body camera footage. Zachary's misconduct came to light when body cam videos showed him holding a plastic baggie in his hand before he searched the vehicle of a woman he later arrested for possession. This suspicious behavior raised doubts and triggered an investigation into his activities. When investigators searched Zachary's patrol vehicle, they reportedly discovered ready-to-plant substances and substance paraphernalia in the trunk. That evidence, prosecutors said, proved that Zachary had substances on him, which he then used to plant on victims during traffic stops. The discovery in his car led to Zachary's suspension from his duties in 2019. That same year, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement concluded its investigation, leading to his arrest. After his arrest, prosecutors were forced to drop charges in over 100 cases involving Zachary during the 2 years the Jackson County Sheriff's Department employed him. One of the key witnesses at Zachary's trial was a victim of his misconduct. Teresa Odom testified that in 2018, Zachary stopped her for a broken brake light and requested to search her trunk. Despite her initial resistance, Teresa eventually agreed, allowing Zachary to proceed with the search. To her surprise, he alleged that he had found a bag of in her purse. Teresa vehemently denied possessing any substances, but in order to avoid a lengthy legal battle, she pleaded no contest and received 4 years probation. However, her conviction was later thrown out after her involvement in Zachary's case came to light. The defense attempted to portray Zachary as a law-abiding citizen who regularly attended church and made significant contributions to his community. His wife, Rebecca, pleaded for leniency, stating that her husband was a good man who had made mistakes. However, the evidence presented at his trial suggests that Zachary's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of corruption. Zachary Wester was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The harm caused by Zachary's actions was immeasurable, both for individuals and for the community as a whole. Fortunately, the victims of Zachary's crimes were eventually granted a $1 million settlement to share. This settlement aims to compensate them for their losses and hardships caused by Zachary's actions. It's a small step towards restoring justice and repairing the damage caused by his corrupt conduct. While still a dirty cop, Zachary Wester did not engage in any criminal activities that resulted in someone dying. The same can't be said about Desmond Mills and his sinister actions.
Desmond Mills pled guilty to excessive force and conspiracy to witness tampering today. He's now facing 15 years in prison. He's expected also to plead guilty to several other charges.
Desmond Mills, a former jailer, was hired by the Memphis Police Department in March 2017 and became part of a predictive policing unit called Scorpion. The unit's name, Scorpion, stood for Street Crimes Operation to restore peace in our neighborhoods. Predictive policing is a strategy that aims to utilize data analysis and statistical algorithms to identify areas of crime and develop strategies to prevent them. The officers in the Scorpion unit, including Desmond Mills, were not your typical law enforcement officers. They dressed in plain clothes and wore bulletproof vests marked police. However, their appearance was not the only thing that set them apart from other officers. These officers were also equipped with unmarked vehicles, allowing them to operate covertly and evade detection by the general public. On January 7, 2023, Desmond Mills and 4 other officers within the Scorpion unit performed a traffic stop on Tyre Nichols. Tyre was a 29-year-old African-American man who worked for FedEx and was an amateur photographer in his free time. Due to his battle with Crohn's disease, Tyre was on the thinner side, weighing only 145 pounds. When the traffic stop occurred at 8:24 p.m., Tyre was only 2 minutes away from his home. Little did he know that this event would mark the beginning of a tragic chain of events that would end his life. According to reports, Desmond and the other officers involved pulled Tyre out of his car to the ground, where they tased him and threatened him. Several moments later, another officer deployed pepper spray into Tyre's face, causing extreme pain and disorientation. Despite the 5 officers attempting to hold him down, Tyre managed to break free from their grasp and began running. The officers promptly gave chase. The officers eventually caught up with Tyre, and a brutal assault ensued. Desmond Mills, wielding his baton, mercilessly beat Tyre while another officer punched him several times in the face. Another officer joined in, kicking him in the torso, causing severe injuries. Throughout the assault, Tyre could be heard desperately shouting for his mother. However, his pleas went unanswered, and he was left to endure the relentless beating. Paramedics were called to the scene by the police officers, and Tyre was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Tragically, 3 days later, Tyre succumbed to his injuries, leaving behind a grieving family and a community in turmoil. The attorney representing Tyre's family has alleged that he was tortured to death by the police officers. This horrifying allegation prompted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to open an investigation into the allegations of excessive force used during Tyre's arrest. 2 weeks later, on January 24, 2023, the Department of Justice and the FBI announced that they would also be opening a civil rights investigation. This development intensified scrutiny in the officers involved in Tyre's death. Several days later, the 5 officers involved in the incident were placed on administrative action, and eventually, the department fired them, effectively ending their professional careers. The culmination of the investigations resulted in the arrest of Officer Desmond Mills and the 4 other officers involved in Tyre's death. They were charged with second-degree murder and other charges related to the incident, including aggravated assault, kidnapping, official misconduct, and oppression. Several days later, all 5 officers involved in the incident that led to Tyre's death made bail and were released. In the aftermath of the incident, the Scorpion Unit was disbanded. In November 2023, Desmond Mills pleaded guilty to the state charges as part of an agreement with federal prosecutors. Desmond agreed to testify against the other 4 officers at their trials as part of the plea agreement. The prosecution recommended a 15-year sentence for Desmond. However, Desmond's sentencing hearing, originally scheduled to be held in May 2024, was postponed until November. He will be free until then. Desmond Mills isn't the only dirty cop who has killed an innocent person. Newman Raja committed a heinous crime that shook the law enforcement community.
Newman Khan Raja, defendant, verdict. We, the jury, find as follows. As to count 1, we find a defendant guilty of manslaughter while armed with a firearm as charged in the information.
Newman Raja, a Muslim man with Pakistani heritage, became a naturalized American citizen in 2001. Married with 2 children, Newman had a deep desire to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had served as a police chief in Pakistan. After years of working in a small police department in Florida, Newman left his post in 2013 and joined the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department. On October 18, 2015, Corey Jones, an employee of the Delray Beach Housing Authority, found himself in a difficult situation. After completing a gig with his band, Corey's vehicle broke down on Interstate 94. Frustrated and in need of assistance, Corey called his bandmate, who arrived promptly with the necessary oil to refill the car. Despite their efforts, Corey and his bandmate were unable to start the vehicle. Corey called for a tow truck, and his bandmate left, sure that Corey would get home safely. Little did they know that Corey's life was about to take a tragic turn. As the night unfolded, Newman, working as a plainclothes police officer in an unmarked white van with tinted windows, came across Corey's vehicle. Newman, who was conducting burglary surveillance, claimed that Corey, who was armed, confronted him. According to Newman's account, the situation left him with no choice but to discharge his weapon. With 6 shots being fired, Corey was hit with 3 bullets. One of the bullets struck a major blood vessel near his heart, ultimately leading to his death. The other 2 bullets hit Corey in his left elbow and right shoulder, breaking his arm from the impact. At the time, Newman was not wearing a body camera, nor did he have his vehicle equipped with a dash cam. Internal Affairs with the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department launched an investigation into Corey's death, resulting in Newman being placed on administrative leave and later terminated from his job. On June 1, 2016, a grand jury charged Newman with manslaughter and attempted first-degree murder with a firearm. The state attorney's office of Palm Beach County alleged that Newman had acted wrongfully when he opened fire at Corey, as Newman never identified himself as a police officer. The state attorney's office argued that Newman's actions were unjustified and led to Corey's death. Newman was released on bond following his arrest and placed on house arrest. One of his conditions of release required him to hand over his passport and wear an ankle monitor to track his movements. In March 2019, a jury found Newman guilty of manslaughter and attempted first-degree murder following a trial that lasted for a week. The jury found Newman guilty of recklessly causing Corey's death and trying to kill him with a firearm. Newman was sentenced to 25 years in prison the following month. Following the trial, Corey's family filed a wrongful death suit against the city of Palm Beach Gardens. The suit aimed to hold the city accountable for allowing Newman to serve in a position of authority as a corrupt cop. Corey's family believed that the city's negligence had contributed to Corey's death, and they hoped to obtain justice through the legal system. Now we head to Australia, where a devoted cop had associations with organized crime ring members.
There are people who believe that I'm the most corrupt, wicked, diabolical person in the world. I can never change their mind.
The story of Roger Rogerson has become one of the oldest stories of police corruption in Australia, so much so that he came to be regarded as the most notorious cop in Australia. Roger Caleb Rogerson was in the New South Wales police force until he was dismissed from the force in 1986. Why did he do that? We'll find out soon enough. Why exactly was Rogerson's story splashed across headlines for a long time? The reason is that before his crimes were unearthed, he had received 13 awards for his devotion to duty, bravery, and outstanding policeman. The first indicator of something going on was Roger's association with other corrupt cops and organized crime ring members, including a substance dealer and convicted substance dealer named Arthur Neddy Smith. Eventually, Smith would claim that Roger had given him the green light and permission to commit the crimes, including up to 8 murders. Roger had worked on some of the biggest cases in the 1970s, and this garnered him more attention as a police officer. He worked on the Toe Cutter gang murder and the Whiskey Au Go-Go fire. Things started to go downhill in 1981 when he shot Warren LaFranchi, a substance dealer. Even though Roger claimed he had acted in self-defense, testimony claimed that Rogerson killed Warren after he robbed the dealer, who was supposedly under police protection. It was also claimed that Warren shot at a police officer during the supposed deal. A woman who had testified against Rogerson in this case was later found murdered in a pond in Centennial Park shortly after.
Rogerson shooting dead 3 people in the line of duty, including drug dealer Warren LaFranchi in a Chippendale laneway in 1981.
I said, this bloke's going to shoot me. I knew he was going to pull the trigger, so I fired twice. And he's fallen over and he's landed in the gutter.
Despite this incriminating evidence, Rogerson continued to work in the police force, and he wasn't charged for the murder of Warren. Once again in 1984, Rogerson was allegedly involved in the shooting of a fellow officer, Michael Drury. Michael had been feeding his 3-year-old daughter in the kitchen on the night of June 6, 1984, when he was shot twice from the window. He survived the shooting to testify against Rogerson. While Michael was testifying, he claimed that he had refused to accept a bribe from Rogerson to tamper evidence in a trial of a convicted dealer who was working with Christopher Flannery, a man Rogerson was closely affiliated with. The dealer, Alan Williams, then testified that Rogerson and Flannery had agreed to kill Drury for 50,000 Australian dollars each. However, in 1989, the charges were dropped and Rogerson was acquitted. The charges didn't stop coming, however, because Rogerson was then convicted of substance dealing and conspiring with a dealer named Dennis Allen to smoothen the process of dealing. However, this appeal was also dropped and he walked away free. By November 1989, even though the charges against him were dropped, he was dismissed from active service because of the Drury case. He was eventually arrested in 1990 and jailed for 9 months for the crime of fabricating evidence. In 2005 again, Rogerson was arrested with his wife, Anne Malacco, for perjury. They had both lied to the Police Integrity Commission. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, but he only spent 12 months and was released on account of good behavior.
Mr. Rogerson is being taken from the steps of his family home now. Mr. Rogerson, do you maintain your innocence?
Absolutely.
Do you maintain your innocence, sir?
We're back to the Gestapo days now.
The last trial Rogerson stood for was the murder of 20-year-old student Jamie Gow in 2014. Jamie was allegedly murdered after a substance deal had gone wrong, involving Rogerson and a former cop, Glenn McNamara. They were charged to court in March 2015, where they pleaded not guilty to murdering Jamie and supplying almost 3 kilograms of methamphetamine. The trial was aborted the next day because there had been mention of Rogerson killing 2 or 3 people when he was in active service. The trial was restarted in February 2016, and on September 2, 2016, Rogerson was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Jamie Gow. He tried one more time to file an appeal to have the sentence cancelled in 2020, but his appeal was refused and Rogerson continued to serve time until 2024. On January 18, 2024, Rogerson was rushed to the hospital after he suffered an aneurysm. He eventually died on January 21st after he was taken off life support. He was 83 when he passed away. An investigation was opened into his death because of the protocol regarding deaths that happen in police custody. Rogerson's story was so infamous that it was portrayed on TV in a miniseries in 1995. After witnessing the corruption of these 30 cops, you won't want to miss the next group of officers who believe they are above the law.